Alan, welcome to my Safety Tech podcast. Thanks so much for joining me. Do you want to start by giving us an introduction to yourself and your background?
So I'm Allan Binns. I'm a director at Project for Safety. I've been in construction for over 20 years now. Uh, um, I started out in electrical engineering, but moved over to design and health and safety about 12 years ago now. Predominantly been working with architectural practices, helping them with CDM compliance. And 5 years ago, I started looking at the Building Safety Act as well, chairing an early steering group with the membership of the APS. And since then, I've gone on to become an executive of the Building Safety Alliance, who have been proactively looking at the practical implications of the new legislation.
So 5 years looking at the Building Safety Act. Have you worked it out yet?
Getting close. Getting close. Yeah, no, it's been just wholesale change for the industry. Massive kind of cultural change that I still think all disciplines are getting their heads around at the moment as well.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? I like it sometimes in safety when we implement a change because it's a new, exciting thing to get your head around. And I quite like that challenge. But the Building Safety Act has been a bumpy rollout, should we say. And I don't know, did you see the draft? It was a legal judge ruling the other day that came out about rooftop terraces. Yeah. It almost completely rewrites it, doesn't it, in terms of what constitutes a HRB. So you'll have had a lot of things that have fallen out of scope that are now in scope, I'm guessing.
Yeah. I mean, I dare say, the change was a challenge, but I kind of enjoyed that challenge. I've got a master's in philosophy, and
I saw that. I was going to ask you about that, actually.
I kind of took reading the legislation in the secondary legislation as almost a bit of academic work, to be honest. So for me, it was the kind of approaching it as a critical thinker more than a practitioner in a way. So that's kind of been my approach to it all.
Yeah. And then what's your background in tech in terms of the tech and maybe the data side as well?
So not a great deal, if I'm honest, the kind of qualifications or anything as such. About 20 years ago, I worked on a vehicle tracking system, and that kind of piqued my interest a little bit. I was, just providing kind of UX, UI, kind of work on that. Yeah, I think tech's always been with me, but for me, I've worked in CDM for a long time and kind of felt the stresses and the strains with that being it not really being, particularly the CDM principal design role, not really being implemented or having a decent uptake within the industry. And I think a lot of those barriers there could be broken down through integrating better digital tools as well. Well, first and foremost, it's, we tend to silo ourselves off in CDM away from the rest of the design team. We're working in Excel, they're working in Revit, they're working in a common data environment. Do we really actually do that as much as we should be doing? So it is about integrating.
Absolutely. So what are we going to talk about? When we had this conversation initially, one of the things that interested us both was the accident statistics, the HSE's accident statistics, particularly in construction. And we actually had a really interesting conversation about that. So is that something that you want to kick off with?
Yeah. So, we had a catch up, with a demo showcasing into it. And, we was looking at the software and talking about, how digital tools, can improve the efficacy of safety services, across construction. And I guess somewhat Socratically, I put it to you is, we've seen, fatalities in construction absolutely plateau for the last 5-10 years. How can digital tools, move the needle is the big question. So, I think there is definitely something in AI and digital tools in general just about removing administration, removing tasks that aren't particularly engaging to kind of actually put the focus on where it needs to be.
Yep. So one of the things that we've said is that the fatal accident statistics for the UK, I hate calling them statistics because it's a loss of life, so it sounds very, I don't know, cold, but it's not meant in that way. But one of the numbers, they are coming down. They just haven't, I don't think they've plateaued. They are coming down. They're just not coming down as quickly as they were. So when we started recording these fatal workplace accidents back in there's early days from like the 1970s when the Health and Safety at Work Act came in, right? And it's sort of it's quite hard to read because it's on a graph, and it sort of looks like it's around about 2,500 workplace fatalities a year, which is considerable, right? Given the number of people in the workplace at the time, was obviously a lot lower than it is now, is my point. So less workers, so per 100,000, the fatalities are through the roof. They're dramatic compared to what they are now. But there is also this argument that back then we were doing higher risk activities. So if you think about the 1970s, a lot more manufacturing, a lot more mining, sort of heavier risk industries, right? But the statistics, the numbers are coming down. They dropped really dramatically from the 1970s. When I started in safety, there were about 150 workplace fatalities per year. Then we got down to, I want to say 136, and then it went up a little bit to 138 this year. But it's still come down, right? So say from 150 to 138, that's a significant drop in terms of a percentage. We seem to say in safety that this number is plateaued. And I'm trying to think about this critically. What are your thoughts on that, first of all?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, population going up, number of workers going up, and the number of fatalities, staying about the same. Particularly when you look at construction, I think around 2020 it was about low 40s in terms of the number of fatalities, and now we're up to in the 50s now.
Yep.
It's very difficult to kind of play that off against kind of the percentage population growth as well. And so that's why I use the term plateauing, because we did see, I think with the introduction of, say, CDM 97, from there onwards, we saw, like, was it CDM 97 or 94? 2007 was, anyway, the early iteration of CDM, we saw it come down quite rapidly, and then it just seems to have kind of bumped along a little bit, say, for the last 10 years. One of the things my thoughts on now is, have we exhausted everything within CDM?
Yeah.
To get us to this point, is that at its most effectiveness that it can be for what it is?
Yep.
And then now, are we looking at things around behavioural safety that are the next thing? And that's where I was kind of starting to think around the role of digital technology and what the role that can play from stopping any these fatalities happening.
So again, just to go back, and by the way, I'm not trying to play devil's advocate here. I'm just trying to make sure that we get off on the right footing in terms of the problem that we're actually trying to solve. And I think it is interesting being sort of critical about it. I kind of almost wish we could pull the data up on the screen or something and actually have a detailed conversation about it. But I feel my technical ability would let me down. I'd end up just crashing the podcast video, right? But, 2020, we say that the number of fatalities in construction was lower than what it is now. But 2020 was a weird year, right? No one was working. So of course it's going to be lower. It's not like a little variable. It's massive. Everyone was in lockdown for COVID. And the other thing that I would be really interested in is when we look at the workplace fatalities, a lot of the tier one contractors, like your large construction companies, still continue to work throughout lockdown, right? Construction was one of those activities that was permitted to continue. But actually, when we look at the number of fatalities, and this is where I feel that the HSE statistics lets us down a little bit, is that a lot of the accidents are actually in the SME market. They're in that residential, someone is working as a local builder. Those activities, they plummeted, right? Because they got their furlough pay and no one wanted them in their home. No one wanted a builder coming into their house to do work during lockdown and COVID. So we've got a couple of variables here that I just don't think are neatly, there's not enough information around them to be able to actually make a detailed analysis. Just to look at the overall and go, right, they were 40, now they're 50, therefore what we're doing in safety is failing. I'm not convinced. I don't know.
Well, I think I wouldn't say we're failing. Just thinking, it's looking at, okay, have we exhausted what that bit of legislation does and what is next? And that's why I point to it. COVID's a really interesting one. I was just trying to look at the statistics, say like 2050, because that was around like 30 or 40 fatalities in construction through to over 50 now.
Yeah.
So that's the terminology around plateauing. COVID, I remember there being a bit of a hiatus on site. We're only for about a month, actually, on most of the construction sites I was working on.
Yeah.
And there was a surprising number of riddles happen within like the first week when everyone returned to work.
Yep.
And it was just that, and I will say it's that behavioral element. Again, it's almost people forgot how to be on a construction site when they were taken out of that environment.
Yep.
A lot of it was just around kind of slips, trips and falls kind of thing. But I didn't remember like a really like innocuous injury where it was just a bloke moving a couple of tables, getting prepared for workers to come back, and he rolled his ankle kind of thing. And it was just all of these little kind of injuries just started to appear.
Yeah.
As well. So, but to that wider point, it is just about, if we benchmark, say, where we are in 2015 to where we are today, take a decade of work, that statistics and construction around fatalities generally has remained the same. So how can we move beyond that?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think another one of there was a research study that I read that was very interesting that came out of I want to say it was out of the US, and it looked at investment in safety and the prevalence of safety accidents, and then the subsequent impact on the company value is really interesting. But in a nutshell, it basically suggested that during economically challenging times, it was indicated that there was less investment in safety and therefore accidents went up. So it particularly looked around that sort of 2008 crash time when companies lost money. And at that point, accidents increased quite dramatically. And that's quite interesting because when we look at COVID and post-COVID, I wonder if there were a lot of organizations that were now, their deadlines have been tightened, or the time in order to achieve the deadlines was tightened, and then all of a sudden there's a lot of rush. And that does come back to your point on behavioral-based safety. But again, it's sort of, to me, I feel like when we look at the HSE stats coming out, and this is just me speaking, by the way, I just think they're just rubbish in terms of the level of information and detail that we're provided with. Because say for instance, we look at construction, what is the breakdown in terms of say we take 50 fatalities per year in construction, what is the breakdown of tier one contractors versus SME market, lone builder on site with two subbies? It's like, if we don't know that, if we can't even tell that from the data, it's just pretty terrible data. And as a safety professional, that then gets harder to convince a board that they've got to invest in something. Yeah. Because you just don't have the level of evidence there that you need. I don't know, I'm probably being a bit too challenging this morning and by the way, feel free to tell me if I am, but I just feel every time I read this, that it's very superficial in terms of, 38 workplace fatalities this year. This shows that everything we're doing isn't working. Time to throw it out the window. and do this. And it's just like, no, it doesn't say that. The devil is in the detail, and the detail just isn't there.
Yeah. No, I think, more detail in those statistics would be really beneficial.
100%.
Smaller contractors do get a really bad rap.
Yeah.
It's not helped by friends of me who are, like family-run builders, who refer to me as the enemy for being in health and safety. They don't really help themselves in that respect. It'd be interesting to see that breakdown across kind of, smaller contractors versus tier ones, where are those fatalities sitting? But also when you get down to the detail of, what was the incident? We know that, 50 of the fatalities from 23 to 24 were falls from height. But was
100%.
that falls from height on the lower end of the scale, or was that with tier one?
Yeah, you're right.
And I think that's important for me working in CDM as well as BSA is, if we have got 50 falls from height, does that tell me that, and they're in construction, does that tell me that actually as principal designers, we're not doing enough, we're not designing out enough, or are we accepting of this level as well? So
yeah, no, it's another great point, Alan, and I feel your pain with this, because when I looked at this years ago, and I think I mentioned this in our previous conversation, and it would have been back in 2017 when I did my master's, we looked at the number of falls from height in construction that led to fatalities, and we actually did some research on it. And it's really hard to do the research, by the way. It's really hard. You've actually got to go through and start trying to Google individual cases to be able to break it down, because it's not provided by the HSE, not in the level of detail that you would need. And actually, what we found is you want to know what the falls from height are, right? So then you can apply adequate control measures, or you can implement changes, or you can say, look, this needs to be our focus as a company. So was it from some sort of powered lifting equipment like a mute or a scissor lift, or was it from one of those what do you call them? They got rid of steps on site, didn't they, a few years ago, and everyone actually uses those bloody mini scaffold step tower things. What are they called? I can't remember. They're a nightmare to use, by the way, if you're just doing a little bit of work, because they're a nightmare to move around. They're massive, these things. Someone's going to laugh at me in the comments of this. You don't know what you're talking about, Pete. But yeah, or is it off of step ladders? Is it off of a double extension ladder? Or is it someone on scaffolding? Or was it someone dangling off a rope off a building to do some sort of facade inspection? What is it? And because these are all completely different things, just saying falls from height, it's not good enough. It doesn't make any sense. And then it's really hard to affect a change when we're not entirely sure as a profession exactly what's wrong.
Yeah. This kind of conversation does get me quite excited. I did a bit of work alongside discovering safety, kind of a subset of the HSE, and we were working on the software 3D repo, and what they were developing to go as a bit of a plug-in to 3D repo was this idea of a construction risk library. Whereas if you identified the risk based on, I think it was 6 parameters, the activity, the location, etc., it would give you a list of proposed mitigation. Well, that proposed mitigation would be in line within the general principles of prevention.
Yes.
And each level of that, you could, it worked on a 4x4 matrix, but you could see if the proposed mitigation was going to eliminate the risk or reduce the risk, or you could see whether it was going to be dealt with as part of the design or as part of construction, or if it was going to be residual as well. And that started to create a number related to that control measure on 1 to 16. And that started to get me really interested in the idea of quantifying risk as well, because you could actually turn around to a designer and say, look, this is your risk assessment, and you have, identified 10 risks, and the manner in which you're dealing with them is on the lower end of the scale. you're not actually adhering to the general principles of prevention here. Everything you're doing as control measures is going to be very reactive.
Yes.
But you could get that down to one number as a score against each designer. I thought that was really interesting. But it's this kind of data-driven approach that I'm interested in that can, I think with good data, we can start to move the industry forward a bit more.
Yeah. And I feel like if you look at the workplace fatalities over the years prior to Riddle, so when did Riddle come in? 1995, I think, off the top of my head. Again, someone's going to message me on LinkedIn and say you don't know if I got this wrong, but I think 1995, right? Prior to that, it was some labor statistics that recorded these accident fatalities. I feel like since 1995, HSE have been reluctant to change the recording mechanism. And it's almost like it's become this process of, well, this is how we record it. We've got to keep standardization in order to maintain the benchmark. But the information that's released isn't actually about prevention in the future. It's to benchmark against the past and demonstrate improvement, no matter the consequences. And I think we need to move beyond this basic benchmarking process into actually some decent research to give some targeted key information out to the industry so that we can actually make some real change. And, my point about the SME market before isn't to sort of come down harsh on builders. It's to sort of say, well, actually, do they need some more support? Is this where, are we going to have greater impact by providing some more support to builders? As in for small sole trader limited company, or limited companies with one director, these smaller builders, are we going to be able to, I don't know, partner with someone like My Builder or Checker Trade and actually be able to offer some targeted support? And is that going to make a greater difference to the overall number than just keep pounding the tier one contractors because they've got the cash, so that that any prosecution is going to return you money? And that's me being really cynical now against the HSE, but it just, I don't know.
But it's a fair point. At the end of the day, you're talking, if a tier one contractor is working on a £100 million project and they spend, I don't know, say £100,000 on safety, as a percentage, you go and give that percentage to a house builder and you say, okay, you're going to have that. That's going to equate to about 10 quid to put onto safety.
Yep.
So, it needs to be
proportionate
at the end of the day, of course. Yeah. So, and at the end of the day, we need to understand that with data as well, because are we saying that building big buildings compared to just, building a house is one more risky than the other? I mean, we've certainly stepped away from saying that working at height is anything over 2 meters up. The risks of falling from height are prevalent in both.
Yep. But this is why, we brought in CDM 2015, in part, was to look at these domestic sort of construction works that fell outside of the commercial, the large commercial, and to look at improving safety for these smaller contractors in domestic settings. And a lot of it was around the basement excavations in London, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, I shouldn't laugh because it's quite serious, but it's like because the land value is so much, they start digging tunnels underground in order to maximize land, and it just sort of fell completely outside. It was off the HSE's radar completely. And then, this was a major issue because they had a couple of quite significant collapses, didn't they? And I think I'm right in saying that was part of the reason for bringing this sort of domestic element into CDM 2015. But other than the legislation, there doesn't seem to have been any further enforcement of it in that sector. But I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong there as well, but it just doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, it's interesting that what we're seeing now with the Building Safety Act. So with the Gateway 2 applications that have been going in, we saw some data around the first 1,001. 40% were just not being validated. And of the 147 that have got through to approval, vast majority were, well, in fact, the vast majority of the applications were for refurbishments of existing HRBs. And then this is the other end of the spectrum, where we've got a piece of legislation that is actually capturing very small kind of refurbishment works in flats.
Yes.
Now, that's being brought into this very high profile piece of legislation. Probably arguably not what it was intended to do.
No, agreed.
And really, I think anyone who's been involved in the Building Safety Act, we know the amount of delays that are there with these Gateway 2 applications and the frustrations of the industry as well. And it's caught these small works in its net, which is completely opposite really of what you're saying about CDM, where you've got a lot of kind of small domestic works that are just not being captured.
Yep, absolutely. I think I heard the other day about the Building Safety Act, actually, that a lot of the, and correct me if I get this wrong, is it approved building control? So
registered building control approvers.
Yes, quite a few of them have. Well, I've heard rumours that a few of them are shutting up shop, should I say, is an easy way to say, and that's passing a lot of the responsibility then back onto the local authority. But where you've got a project that's mid process in terms of what would have been the gateway process, so it wouldn't have fallen under Gateway 1, because the works were already underway. But where they're private building control, for want of a better word, because I can't remember what it's called for the life of me now, have gone bust. They've then had to go back to local authority. And then, of course, when local authority get involved, it's very hard to skip through Gateway 2 and 3 without having Gateway 1 in place. But then, because it already started post Gateway 1, it's very hard to retrospectively apply Gateway 1. So it's like, my God, what a nightmare. What a nightmare.
I mean, anything that hasn't been captured, or anything that doesn't legally need to work under the new legislation has to work under the transitional arrangements.
Yes.
And you're right, you are effectively required to adhere to the building regulations, amendments and everything else that goes with it, or Building Safety Act, because you'll ultimately have to have that information available at the end of the project. So there is a bit of a challenge there. Even though it's not mandated for you, you still need to go through all of that process.
Yeah, absolutely. I did wonder, I did the FPA podcast a little while ago, and we were talking about data in fire safety, and I find data in fire safety a lot harder to deal with than safety for some reason. I don't know why, I just find it harder to get my head around. But I did say the KBI submissions for the HRBs, that would have been a very interesting data set to start to analyze in terms of the volume of information that went in. Because didn't they say it was around about 11,000 HRBs registered? And I remember when I was doing it, it was about 46 different headings of information. So not the initial, but the full KBI submission. That was just for anyone listening, the key building information. So this was things like submission of numbers of fire doors, firefighting lifts, etc., etc. That would have been a really interesting bit of data to do some analysis on, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot in just being data driven across the board, not just with KBIs, safety case reports as well. But a lot of, with KBIs, the parameters they're known, what you have to submit, as you say. I think we need to kind of project that through every element of what we're doing.
Yep.
In terms of how we deal with not just building regulation compliance, but also CDM as well. And I guess I had a bit of a revelation maybe a year or two ago about how much we were focusing on producing documents within CDM as opposed to producing information.
Yeah.
And actually being kind of data driven in that way. as well.
Yeah. Yeah, because
Well, the simple example would be just designers' risk assessments. We ask for designers' risk assessments and we get, 5 or 6 back, and they're all in completely different formats.
yeah,
This is not good data at the end of the day. And then if you start to get that standardized approach by, say, applying 1192-6 and the mandated parameters there, you get consistency across your project. You get usable data now
yeah,
that can be put into a safety case or whatever. But then if you're starting to have that, international standard, or universal standard, not quite an international one yet, across all your projects, you've now got, a valuable data set that you can start to look at trends.
yeah, yeah. I agree. And I like this idea of standardization. A lot of the companies that I've seen have mixed portfolio. So they were trying to apply the standard to HRBs, and they were trying to apply a standard to buildings above 11 meters and, residential above 11 meters under the Fire Safety England regs. And then they're trying to apply different standards to commercial. It's like, you might as well just apply the same standard to a point, because at least then you get some standardization. If that's just your process of how you share documentation, store it, provide it in a digital format, I think it's a lot easier to manage. Whereas if you start trying to piecemeal apply things to different aspects or parts of buildings, it starts to become more complicated.
Yeah, and I've had some really good conversation with some tier ones over the last year as well. People who work both in England and in Scotland. Now, in Scotland, the Building Safety Act effectively doesn't apply, but instead of kind of, dealing them as separate things altogether, they want to standardize their approach across their portfolio. So what they're taking, the highest common denominator across everything and then trying to apply that across the board. And I think stuff like that's, really, really good to see.
Yeah. Yeah. No, interesting. Where do you think we're going to go in the future then in terms of safety data? Because one of the things that I alluded to before that really concerns me is that, and I think this is the reason why I get so passionate about things like the HSE statistics, is that people go, well, those, in construction, those fatalities have increased to 50. Therefore, what we're doing isn't working. Therefore, we're going to reintroduce all of these new measures. And it's like, no, come on. Look where we've come from. Look where we're going to. It's definitely improved. There's a couple of wobbles every so often. But hang on, I'm asking 2 questions here, but I'm going to do it because I've gone off on a tangent now. But improvement isn't always linear. Improvement takes time and it can be a little wobbly road. There's no doubt that we've made improvement from where we were, particularly if you go beyond 10 years ago, right? Which isn't that long ago, really. We've made significant improvements. What do you think we need to do in terms of the data to continue to make that improvement in safety? And I'm not just talking about workplace fatalities and the HSE, I'm talking like across the board.
Huge question that. I mean, something I'm very conscious of at the moment is that when working on projects, Building Safety Act is absolutely the focus, and CDM has really fallen into the background. I would say as an industry, we did not master CDM. It did not get implemented in a way that the regulation required it to be.
Yeah.
And I think we need to understand that from a data point of view. You speak to principal designers and it is like Principal Designers Anonymous, talking about the ills of what they do day to day and that. So, but that's, it's all anecdotal. Let's get the data behind that. When are CDM principal designers being appointed onto projects? Let's understand how designers are adhering to the general principles of prevention as a number. And I think, that is the kind of approach that I think we do need to start to see, because there are numbers there in terms of fatalities and everything that, that need challenging at the end of the day.
Yep.
How do we move forward? Is 50, 51 acceptable? No. So we need to drive that. The idea that the creation of the Building Safety Act, and especially the secondary legislation, the amendment to building regulations, is built upon the CDM regulations. The same people wrote it. The language is exactly the same. The duty holders, the names of the duty holders are the same, although they are separate. CDM, it was always understood that the CDM principal designer should be the lead designer.
Okay.
That was HSE's vision. When they implemented it in 2015, within 5 years, the lead designer would automatically take this role on. And what we saw, and great that there is data out there, over 50% of the time, that role was being picked up, not by the lead designer, but by project managers, QS, third parties, that weren't related to that design, which is a shame. And actually, we should be starting to deal with that bit of data as well to make those positive changes. So we have got people who have got influence over the design actually driving that forward as well.
Yeah. You mentioned before about quantifying risk, and you sort of almost alluded to taking the subjectiveness out of the evaluation of risk.
Yeah.
That's something that I'm really passionate about, and I think we can only do with a lot of data and a lot of information. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of data mining that needs to be done. We need to look at all the RIDDOR statistics.
Yeah.
And I know there are, I think that Discover and Safety are doing something with AI to do this, to look at, who, what, where, why around all of these, because these are the areas that we should be targeting at the end of the day. These are the areas that we need special consideration for in our designs and certainly in the construction phase as well.
Yeah. I can't quite get my head around this concept though with the RIDDOR, in terms of, did you ever hear the story, and I'm going to massacre this story now, but it was the chap that was called in to look at where to armor planes during the Second World War, the bombers that were coming back. So when the bombers were coming back, they were coming back with holes in them, and he was asked to look at where they could armor them in order to, I don't know, make them more resilient. I just made that up. I've hashed this story up. But he pointed out straight away, he goes, yeah, but these are the ones that come back. If you want to make the difference, you need to analyze the ones that didn't come back. You're armoring the wrong ones. The fact that these have come back. And I almost feel that there's some sort of connection there with the riddles. It's like, well, you're analyzing the riddles. These have definitely gone wrong. You get much more in analyzing the ones that have very nearly gone wrong. But there's no way to get that data. I know I've got that very wrong, by the way, but there's a lack of standardization in terms of the accidents that didn't quite make riddle, but could have done on any other occasion.
Yeah, and this is a part of risk management I've never been able to crack. When we're working on projects, we've got known knowns, we've got known unknowns, but the ones that hurt you are the unknown unknowns. And it's how do you get to them? If you ask a designer to give you a designer's risk assessment, having furnished them with pre-construction information, they will tell you the risks that are written in that package there. They will tell you about the very obvious risks that exist within their design. But what they won't tell you is the things that they haven't seen and haven't considered, and therefore have not controlled. That's the bit where you have that blind spot.
Yeah, it's the very famous Rumsfeld matrix, isn't it? Known knowns, unknown unknowns, and in between. Yeah. That's interesting. I feel like in safety, there's a lot of subjectivity, but the interesting thing about that is that it's very easy then to discredit because it's not based on tangible fact. It's based on experience, qualification, and just general opinion. And I can't, and which by the way is all very respectable, right? There's no doubt about it. But then in safety, then we try to influence, and we get told a lot about how to influence people, how to change our communication style, how to identify individual personality types and, try to appeal to those personality types of the individuals that we're trying to convince. I sometimes can't help but feel that if we had some better cold hard facts, it would be a lot easier. Like, let's take another industry with risk, right? Finance. There are huge guesswork in finance. Like, there's no doubt about it. You see it all the time, and you see it when it's gone wrong. But I would say probably 95% of it, there is some element of tangible fact behind it. There is some element of an awful lot of data, an awful lot of experience, an awful lot of computing power that's gone into actually calculating what's going to happen in what situation and why. And I feel like this is why AI has done so well in the fintech world over the past decade or so, because it's the facts speak for themselves.
Yeah. So this is a bit of a bugbear of mine, but it's how accidents and probably more perversely fatalities are like communicated within health and safety.
Yep.
Like every day I go on my like LinkedIn and you will see videos of like accidents happening.
Hate seeing those. They ruin my day in the morning when I open LinkedIn. I hate it.
And it winds me up because there's some people on there going, oh, this is ridiculous. Why does it keep happening? Absolutely right. But really, the way in which they're posted, they're kind of just being showcased as entertainment in clickbait as well. And I just like, it's not cool. Like we need to get away from that. And as you say, get down to some hard facts and hard statistics about this.
Yeah. And this is the thing for me. This is what really excites me about risk assessment. Without sounding so sad, I just realized what I just said. But if you're listening to this podcast up until this point, you're probably going to have a similar mentality. You're going to be as boring and as super interested in this as I am. But this is the thing about risk assessment, right? It's that organizations, I think, again, you alluded to this, they just see it as a bit of paper, as a tick box exercise. Have you got a risk assessment for this? And in no way have they ever actually really fundamentally thought about what that risk assessment is, because that risk assessment is everything. To be honest, you could probably get rid of every other piece of health and safety and just have that risk assessment, because it identifies all the hazards in the organization. And that box alone is worth its weight in gold, because most people don't know what their organizational hazards are. They don't know what their departmental hazards are. They don't know what their organizational hazards are. They don't know what the industry hazards are. They don't know what the country's hazards are. They just go hazards. And people just free reign to write whatever you want in there. And they'll ask anyone to do it. Anyone can do a risk assessment, right? You don't have to be a safety professional. There's no standardization. It's just someone with a pen and a piece of paper, obviously now Word and a keyboard, and they just type in everything they can possibly imagine as a hazard based on what they can see around them. It just feels like such an inaccurate process. And then control measures is an organization's safety spend. That's an organization's commitment to spend their money mitigating these hazards, and this is what we're going to do about it. And there is just no evaluation whatsoever. It's just, we just write it all down. It's just a shopping list, like this massive wish list of everything. Like when you're a kid and you write your Christmas list, it's just everything. I want a new skateboard. I want this. There's no rhyme or reason to it. Sometimes there's just everything goes in there. There's no consideration of the efficacy of those control measures and how they tie up with the hazards and where those hazards sit in terms of the hierarchy of your organization and what your targets are. It's just stuff. And to me, when people talk about safety data, the first thing we think of is leading and lagging indicators. The first thing I always think of is risk assessments now. So what are you writing in there? Who's writing it? Why? What evaluation have you done? How many organizations have ever cross-referenced their control measures with what they're actually spending their money on in terms of their budget? I reckon very few. Less than 1%, maybe less than 0.1%.
Yeah. I was doing a webinar for the APS yesterday, and I got on my high horse a little bit about about risk assessment. The risk assessments I tend to see most of are designers' risk assessments. And
so I'm guessing there's an awful lot more consideration gone into those, right? Because there's real money behind that if you get it wrong.
well, I would say, I mean, there are still problems there though. And that is, when we ask for a risk assessment, I mean, first of all, let's tell them what format we want it in. That'd be a great start for standardization. But let's not just ask for a risk assessment outright, because in one breath, they are telling you what the hazard is, what the risk is, who's at risk, how likely it is, how they've controlled it, and done. That's it. And it just becomes done and dusted as a static document. And it's challenged once and that's it. But what I've always been keen on is using, BIM execution plans to kind of fragment that process a bit. Let's just start with, Reba stage 2. Just tell me what the hazard is and who's at risk. Let's just deal with that first. And let's look at it and think about it. Then in the next stage, let's start to devise some control measures. Not firming anything up or anything, but let's have a conversation about this. And then, when we get later in the project, let's firm these things up and go to a technical level of detail. All too often, we're just trying to eat the elephant and we're creating very static risk assessments. So it goes to your point, even with not just on projects, but within businesses as well. Producing a risk assessment, I immediately think of just someone just sitting down with an Excel and just type it in, probably not even walking around the building that they're kind of risk assessing, So having something that's a lot more fragmented in that way, I think is really beneficial.
See, this is one of the things that I was really interested in with moving to Intuity in terms of the AI risk assessment platform. To me, it's beyond just adding in missed recommendations. It's actually about getting to the point where we've got the data to be able to take away control measures that are deemed ineffective against the expenditure to implement them. So really doing an actual real test of what's reasonably practicable, and actually having the data around reasonably practicable. And I love this concept. And I think we'll be there within the next 5 years, I would say, with tech to be able to actually start taking away control measures that are deemed ineffective.
We kind of, when we were talking about this, we, I'm sorry, there's a bit of a philosophy edge here.
No, go for it.
We segued on to that cost benefit analysis piece.
Yeah.
But about kind of consequential and categorical imperatives. And, it comes down to the cost of life at the end of the day. That's what you're going to be looking at in terms of that, though, isn't it, really? When we're talking about reasonably practicable, we're weighing up the cost in terms of time and resource and money to implement something to reduce risk.
Well, you're right if we take it to a significant degree. I would never want to sit there and balance out a control measure and go, okay, can we afford to lose a life here? That's not why I ever got into safety. That is not a conversation I would ever want to have. It's like, oh God, if we've gone that far. But you and I both know that when you look at most control measures, I would probably say 80% of control measures that I will look at on a lot of risk assessments. That, by the way, that was a terrible percentage. I need to delete that out because that sounded awful. 80% of the time it works every time, right? It's like an Anchorman line. But no, look, an awful lot of the control measures that you see listed, they're not going to save someone's life. And the issue that I see with that then is when you look at a risk assessment, it can become cluttered, and then it's very hard for the actual end user to see the wood for the trees. I would love it if we got to the point where, someone that was working at height, for example, the two control measures that they absolutely must do to not die are these, and they're at the top with lights around them flashing in red, and a siren going off. Everything else further down the list, right? It's like, that's just noise on a page. And a lot of what we do in safety now isn't about it's gone from identifying the significant risks, which is what risk assessment was about, right? Identifying the significant risks to just identifying every single risk possible in case it's needed in civil court or criminal court.
Yeah, absolutely significant and or unusual risks that are project or, company specific. That's what we need to focus on and need to target. And you're right, risk assessments do get cluttered with just generic stuff.
Yep.
I remember receiving a designer's risk assessment for a refurbishment of a commercial unit within a train station that was in Scotland, and it referenced the Liverpool Leeds Canal because the document had just been copied and pasted across,
That's always the way. Yeah.
That kind of thing. But yeah, I think, risk assessments are, the absolute foundation of what we should be doing. And as well, I think certainly within CDM, some of the other stuff around that, the administrative stuff around that has just detracted away from that being the absolute focal point.
Yeah. So what do you do with Project 4, Alan? What's your sort of day-to-day?
Maybe a dog's body. So I'm a director. I oversee and run a number of projects. They are predominantly higher risk buildings, where we are providing the building regulations principal designer, Building Safety Act advisor, CDM principal designer, and CDM advisor roles on them. So I'll have a team of me working under me, and we'll be delivering those services. And a lot of that is about working with design teams to deliver safe designs to ensure that they're compliant with both CDM regulations and building regulations. But I guess there's my side of things that gets a lot more involved in Gateway 2 applications and BSA as well, and just supporting clients through that process and helping them get validated and approved as quickly and as efficiently as possible.
Amazing. One more question I've got for you. One of the biggest challenges that I saw with the Building Safety Act had nothing to do with the process, everything to do with how the teams communicate with each other based on their background, their training, their approach in terms of safety, building surveyors, architects, project managers, and construction teams all seem to speak a completely different language. We all use different IT systems, different platforms, different everything. The approach was different. And when you put everyone around a table, it was very, very hard to navigate through those almost different cultures in terms of careers and professions. How have you seen, well, first of all, do you agree with that? And how have you, if you do, how have you seen that develop and improve over the past couple of years, or has it?
Yeah, I think, there are different cultures there that exist, and definitely different processes and systems as well. I think that makes things like, the exchange of information requirements and the BEP and everything else like that absolutely critical. From an information management point of view, kind of BIM has very much been self-serving for designers and contractors on projects for communication. But I think that now it needs to extend and be bookended a bit more. We need to be really working with clients to understand what information they want at the end of a project now, particularly for a safety case. So then we can start that process and make sure that we do have the right processes in place for exchanging information as well as we go through. There's been a big change around, particularly on design and build projects as well, because we're having a lot more contractor engagement before we start on site. It's really stopped being design and build and started being design then build. So yeah, getting those guys around the table as well. That's certainly been a lot more collaborative in that regard as well. So it definitely changes to the dynamics that projects are running. But I think overall, it's a marked improvement to where we were a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that's nice. That's nice to hear. Alan, honestly, thank you very much for your time. I really, really appreciate you being on the show. I think I was on one at the beginning of the show. I think maybe my coffee had just kicked in. And as soon as we start talking about HSE statistics, it's very hard to calm me down. But no, honestly, I really appreciate you being on. If anyone wants to reach out to you, how's the best way for them to get in touch with you?
Best way is on LinkedIn, or you can just send an email to me at allanb@projectforsafety.com.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.